The dust was a living thing. It coated Sable's tongue, settled in the folds of her worn dress, and painted the world in a single, weary shade of brown. The stagecoach had left her at the turnoff with a gruff nod, its rattling departure leaving a silence so profound it felt like a weight on her shoulders. Before her, a rutted track snaked through land that looked tired of trying. The grass was pale and sparse, the earth cracked like old pottery. In the distance, a collection of buildings shimmered under the oppressive sun, the dark, unpainted wood of a ranch house, and barn looking more like a scar on the landscape than a home. This was it, Blackwood Creek Ranch, the last name on a list of maybes that had dwindled to a single desperate hope. She hoisted her canvas bag, the meager weight of her life's possessions digging into her shoulder, and began to walk. Each step sent up a small puff of dust, a ghost of the life this land might have once held. She had heard whispers in the last town, whispers about Leland Blackwood, a man who had once been the backbone of this territory, whose herds were thick and whose word was iron. But something had broken in him, they said. His wife had been taken by a fever 2 years prior, and with her, the life of the ranch had seemed to wither. He had stopped hiring, stopped selling, stopped living. He was just holding on. Sabable understood holding on. It was all she had done for the past year, since the cholera had taken her parents and left her with nothing but a name, and a knowledge of the earth that no one seemed to value. As she drew closer, the silence was broken by the rhythmic creak of a pump handle. A man with a graying beard and suspenders over a sweat-stained shirt worked the pump, his movements slow and methodical. He watched her approach, his eyes narrowed with the suspicion reserved for strangers and trouble, which were often the same thing on the frontier. He stopped pumping as she came to a halt a few feet away. "Looking for something, miss." His voice was gravelly, unused to pleasantries. "I'm looking for work," Sable said, her own voice hoarse from the dust. "I heard Mr. Blackwood in need of a hand." The man gave a short, dry laugh that sounded like stones rattling in a tin can. "Mr. Blackwood ain't had need of anything for a long while now, 'cept to be left alone." He looked her up and down, taking in her patched dress and the exhaustion etched onto her face. "This ain't no place for a woman on her own." "I'm not afraid of work," she insisted, her chin lifting just a fraction. "I can cook, I can clean, I can mend, and I can make things grow." That last part made him pause. He squinted at the parched ground around them, then back at her. "Nothin' grows here anymore, miss. The land's given up." He gestured with his thumb toward the main house. "He's in there, but don't say I didn't warn you." Sable nodded her thanks and walked toward the house. Its porch sagged on one side, and the windows were grimed with a layer of dust that blocked out the sun. It was a house that had forgotten what it was for. She climbed the steps, each one groaning in protest, and knocked on the heavy wooden door. The sound was swallowed by the house's oppressive silence. She waited, her heart a nervous bird in her chest. She knocked again, louder this time. The door opened with a sudden, violent jerk. The man who stood there was tall, broad-shouldered, and filled the doorway like a thundercloud. His hair was dark and unkempt, his face shadowed with a stubble that couldn't hide the hard lines of his jaw. But it was his eyes that stole the breath from her lungs. They were the color of a stormy sky, and just as cold. They held a deep, settled grief that had hardened into something impenetrable. This was Leland Blackwood. He looked at her not as if she were a person, but an interruption. "What do you want?" His voice was low and rough, a tool left out to rust. She found her own voice, forcing it to be steady. "My name is Sable. I'm looking for work." He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "I'm not hiring." He started to close the door. "Please," she said, the word escaping before she could stop it. The desperation in her own voice shamed her, but she could not take it back. "I can work. I'll do anything, just for room and board." His gaze swept over her again, lingering for a moment on her hands. They were not the soft hands of a lady. They were chapped and capable, with dirt etched permanently under the nails. He seemed to be fighting some internal battle. His jaw tightened. Finally, with a sigh that sounded like the collapse of a great weight, he stepped back. There's no work, he said, his voice flat. He gestured vaguely toward the side of the house, where a plot of land lay barren and choked with weeds. It might have been a garden once. A tangle of withered vines clung to a rotting trellis. You see that patch of dirt? My wife used to grow things there, flowers, vegetables. Nothing's grown there since she passed. The land is dead. He looked her straight in the eye, a challenge in his cold gaze. You want to work? Work that. If you can make a single living thing sprout from that dust, you can have your keep. Until then, you can sleep in the old tack room in the barn. Don't expect anything more. He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and disappeared back into the shadows of the house, pulling the door shut behind him with a final, definitive thud. Sable stood on the porch, the silence rushing back in. It wasn't a dismissal. But it wasn't a welcome either. It was a dare, an impossible task given by a man who expected her to fail. She looked at the dead garden, at the cracked earth and the skeletal remains of last year's weeds. It was a reflection of the man in the house, barren, grieving, and closed off from the sun. She took a deep breath, the dusty air filling her lungs. A single living thing. That's all he asked for. She could do more than that. She had to. The tack room was small and smelled of old leather and mouse droppings. A simple cot was pushed against one wall, its mattress stuffed with straw that rustled when she set her bag down. There was a single high window, thick with cobwebs, that let in a sliver of dusty light. It was more than she'd had in weeks. She spent the rest of the afternoon exploring her small domain. The dead garden was worse up close. The soil was compacted and pale, starved of water and life. Any other person would have seen it as a lost cause. Sable saw a challenge. She knelt and crumbled the dirt between her fingers. It was dry, yes, but it wasn't sand. It had structure. It had memory. Her father had been a surveyor, a man who read the stories the land told through its contours and creaks. Her mother had been a gardener, a woman who read the stories the soil told through its texture and thirst. Sable had learned both languages. She walked the perimeter of the ranch, her eyes scanning not just the surface, but the way the ground sloped, the types of weeds that managed to survive, the direction the wind blew. She found the creek that gave the ranch its name. It was little more than a trickle, choked with fallen branches and debris, but it was moving. Water was life. The next morning she began. She didn't start with a shovel, she started with a bucket. She followed the creek upstream, away from the ranch. A half-mile on, she found the problem. A great cottonwood had fallen during a storm, its massive trunk and a web of smaller branches forming a natural dam. Water pooled behind it, stagnant and muddy, with only a fraction of its strength pushing through. It would take an axe and more muscle than she had to clear the main log, but she could clear to the smaller debris. For hours she worked, pulling out branches, clearing away packed leaves and mud. Her hands bled. Her back ached. But slowly, the trickle of water past the blockage grew stronger. It wasn't a flood, but it was a current. When she returned to the ranch, her dress soaked and muddy, the old man from the pump, she learned his name was Jed, was watching her. He said nothing, but his eyes followed her as she picked up a rusty wheelbarrow and a pitchfork. She spent the rest of the day clearing the dead weeds from the garden plot, piling them into the wheelbarrow. By dusk, the patch of land was bare, a blank slate of gray earth. She felt Leland's eyes on her from the dark window of the house, a silent, judging presence. She ignored him. This wasn't for him. This was for her. The next few days fell into a rhythm. She rose before the sun, drew her water, and tended to the land. She didn't have tools to properly plow, so she used the pitchfork, driving it into the hard soil again and again, turning it over, breaking up the compacted earth until her arms screamed with the effort. She hauled buckets of rich, dark leaf mold from the banks of the creek and worked it into the pale dirt. She burned the dead weeds and mixed the ash back into the soil, giving it the potash it craved. Jed started leaving a bucket of water for her by the garden plot each morning. He never mentioned it, and she never thanked him. It was a silent understanding. One afternoon, as she was painstakingly picking rocks from the soil, Leland's shadow fell over her. She looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. He stood there, arms crossed, watching her. "You're wasting your time," he said. His voice was not cruel, just stated as a fact. "The soil is tired, not dead," she replied, her voice steady as she dropped another rock into a bucket. "It just needs to be reminded of what it's for." He looked at her hands, which were now raw and calloused. He looked at the neat piles of rocks and the turned earth. Something flickered in his eyes, not approval, but a crack in his certainty. He said nothing more, just turned and walked back to the house. But from then on, she knew he was watching. Not just judging, but watching. She had no seeds. It was a problem she had foreseen. In her canvas bag wrapped in a small piece of cloth were the only things of value she had left from her mother. Seeds, not many. A dozen beans, a pinch of hardy lettuce seeds, some squash, and a few precious tomato seeds. They were meant for her own new start, somewhere, someday. She had been saving them now. She knew this was the place. This was the someday. She carefully planted them in neat rows, pressing each one into the revitalized earth like a prayer. Then came the waiting. She watered the plot every morning and every evening, using the slightly stronger flow from the creek. She shielded the ground from the harshest of the afternoon sun with a piece of old canvas she'd found. She talked to the soil, a habit her mother had taught her, murmuring words of encouragement as if it were a sick child. Jed watched her with a bemused shake of his head. The other two ranch hands, younger men named Gus and Finn, snickered when they thought she couldn't hear. Leland remained a ghost in the window. A week passed, then another. The earth remained stubbornly bare. A knot of despair began to tighten in her stomach. Maybe they were right. Maybe the land, like the man, had truly given up. She was on the verge of admitting defeat, of packing her bag, and facing the dusty road again when she saw it. One morning, in the pearly light of dawn, she knelt by the rows, and there, pushing through the dark soil, was a tiny speck of impossible green. A single sprout. Then another and another. A row of bean seedlings, their first two leaves unfurled like tiny flags of victory. A laugh escaped her, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. It was a sound she hadn't made in over a year. She didn't notice Leland standing on the porch, a mug of coffee held halfway to his lips. He had seen it too. He stood frozen, staring at the small patch of green that had defied his grief. He saw her kneeling in the dirt, her face rough and tight with a triumph that was both fierce and gentle. He watched her gently touch one of the leaves, a gesture of such profound tenderness that it struck him like a physical blow. He turned and went back inside the house without a word. But for the first time in 2 years, the silence inside felt different. It felt invaded. The green things grew with a ferocity that seemed to mock the surrounding desolation. The beans climbed the simple trellises she built from scavenged sticks. The squash plants sent out broad, healthy leaves, and the lettuce formed tight little heads. The change was slow but undeniable. The small patch of green became a magnet for life. Bees buzzed where there had been none. Birds landed on the fence posts. The air itself seemed to smell different around the garden, of damp earth and living plants, a scent that cut through the perpetual dust. Sable's place on the ranch shifted. Jed now greeted her with a quiet mornin'. Gus and Finn stopped snickering and started watching her work with a sort of grudging awe. She was no longer just a stray woman Leland had taken in out of some strange whim. She was the woman who made things grow. She expanded the garden, turning over more soil, planting wild onions she found by the creek, and some hardy herbs she recognized from her mother's garden. She was earning her keep and more. Leland remained distant, a fortress of a man, but the walls had cracks. One morning, Sable came out to find a new, sturdy hoe and a well-made shovel leaning against the garden fence. They were tools from his own workshop, tools he hadn't touched in years. There was no note, no word, but she knew they were from him. She ran her hand over the smooth, worn wood of the handles. It was a conversation without words, a concession. A few weeks later, a late frost was forecast. The news came from a passing rider, a warning that sent a chill of fear through Sable. Her tomato plants were heavy with small green fruit. A frost would kill them instantly. That night, she gathered every scrap of burlap and old cloth she could find. The air grew sharp and cold as the sun went down. She was working by the light of a single lantern, her fingers numb, trying to drape the makeshift covers over her precious plants, when another lantern appeared beside her. It was Leland. He didn't speak. He simply took a corner of a large burlap sack from her and began helping her secure it over the tomato cages. They worked in silence, their movements synchronized in the flickering light. The only sounds were the rustle of the cloth and the sharp intake of their breath in the cold air. At one point, their hands brushed as they reached for the same corner of a sack. His skin was rough and warm. A jolt went through her, sharp and unexpected. She pulled her hand back as if burned. She glanced at him, but his face was in shadow, impossible to read. They finished the work, and just as silently as he had appeared, he picked up his lantern and walked back to the house. Sable stood for a long time in the cold, her heart pounding. It was the longest they had ever been together, and they hadn't said a word. But something had been said all the same. The garden thrived. It became an oasis of color and life. Sable began leaving vegetables on the porch for the main house, a basket of beans, a few ripe tomatoes, a head of lettuce. The first time, the basket sat there all day. The next day it was gone. Soon she started cooking for the hands, making simple, hearty stews in the small bunkhouse kitchen. Jed, Gus, and Finn ate with a gratitude that went beyond mere hunger. They were eating food from their own land again. One evening she made a larger pot of stew than usual, rich with tomatoes and squash and a bit of salt pork Jed had given her. She ladled a bowl for herself and then, on an impulse, filled another. She carried it to the main house and knocked on the door. When Leland opened it, she simply held out the bowl. "You should eat," she said softly. He looked at the steaming bowl, then at her. His eyes, for the first time, looked less like a stormy sky and more like the quiet twilight after the storm has passed. He took the bowl from her. Their fingers brushed. This time, neither of them pulled away. "Thank you," he said. The words were quiet, but they held the weight of 1,000 unspoken conversations. He didn't invite her in, but as she walked away, she felt his eyes on her back, and for the first time, the look was not one of judgment, but of something she couldn't yet name, something that felt dangerously close to need. The success of the garden did not go unnoticed. Riders passing on the main road would slow their horses, staring at the patch of vibrant green in the middle of the otherwise desolate ranch. Word spread to the nearby town of Redemption. The whispers about the strange woman at the Blackwood place began to change. They were tinged with suspicion. It wasn't natural, some said. The land had been cursed since Mrs. Blackwood died. And for it to come back so suddenly, it was the work of something unnatural. The loudest voice belonged to a man named Barlow. He was a neighboring rancher, a man whose ambition was as vast as his own sprawling property. He had been trying to buy Leland's land for the past year, making insultingly low offers, waiting for Leland's grief and neglect to force him to sell. Barlow saw Blackwood Creek not for its grazing potential, but for its water. The creek, however small, was the most reliable water source in the area, and Barlow wanted to control it. Sable's success was a direct threat to his plans. A revitalized ranch was a ranch that wasn't for sale. Barlow started visiting Redemption more often, speaking in low tones in the saloon and the general store. He talked about Sable as if she were a witch, a woman who used strange ways to coax life from dead soil. He played on the fears of the townspeople, on their distrust of outsiders and the unexplained. The town matriarch, a stern woman named Mrs. Pritchard, who saw herself as the guardian of Redemption's moral fiber, took up Barlow's cause. She began to speak of Sable as a blight, a threat to the decent folk of the town. Sable felt the change in the air when she rode into town with Jed for supplies. People who had once given her a polite nod now turned away. Women gathered their children closer as she passed. In the general store, Mrs. Pritchard stood with a group of other women, her voice a sharp whisper that cut off the moment Sable entered. The store owner, who had been friendly on her last visit, served her with a new, Curt efficiency, avoiding her eyes. The hostility was a physical thing, a cold wall she could feel but not see. It was a loneliness that was deeper and more painful than the isolation of the ranch. Leland was aware of the rumors. Jed told him what was being said. The poison Barlow was spreading. A muscle worked in Leland's jaw, a sign of a temper he kept tightly leashed. He started riding the property lines again, a rifle resting in the scabbard of his saddle. He was a man reawakening to the need to defend his territory. He didn't speak to Sable about the rumors, but his presence around the ranch became more constant. He'd appear while she was weeding, ostensibly to check a fence post nearby. He'd be cleaning a rifle on the porch when she brought water from the creek. He was a silent, watchful guardian, and his quiet vigilance was more comforting to her than any words of reassurance could have been. One afternoon, Barlow rode onto the property himself. He didn't approach the house, but rode straight to the garden, reining in his horse and looking down at Sable as if she were something he'd found under a rock. He was a big man with a florid face and small, cunning eyes. "Quite a trick you've got here," he said, his voice slick with false congeniality, making dead land bloom. "Some might find that unnatural." Sable rose slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. She refused to be intimidated. "It's just water and work." "Mr. Barlow, nothing unnatural about it." "Is that so?" he sneered. "Because I hear that creek of yours has been running stronger lately." "Funny thing that. Considering the rest of the territory is dry as a bone." He leaned forward in his saddle. "That water you're using, it feeds into my property downstream, and my cattle are thirsty." Before Sable could reply, Leland's voice cut through the air, cold and sharp as splintered ice. "This is private property, Barlow. State your business or get off it." Leland had come from the barn, moving with a speed and silence that was startling. He stood between Barlow and Sable, a solid wall of defiance. Barlow's face tightened. He hadn't counted on Leland's interference, just admiring the horticulture, Blackwood, Barlow said, his eyes flicking from Leland to Sable and back again, and reminding you of neighborly obligations. "Water rights are a delicate thing out here." He gave a thin, unpleasant smile. "Wouldn't want any misunderstandings." "The only misunderstanding," Leland said, his voice dangerously low, "is you thinking you have a right to be here. Now leave." Barlow held Leland's gaze for a long moment, then tugged on his reins, turning his horse. "You'll regret this, Blackwood," he spat before riding off in a cloud of dust. Sable's hands were trembling. Leland turned to her, his face still hard. He looked at the garden, at the proof of her labor, and then at her. "He won't be back today," he said. It wasn't a promise of safety, just a statement of fact. But in that moment, standing in the sunlight with Leland as her shield, she had never felt safer in her life. The gap between them, the space that had been filled with grief and silence, was now filled with something else. A shared purpose, a common enemy. The threat, when it came, was not with a gun but with a piece of paper. A week after his visit, Barlow returned, and this time he was not alone. He was accompanied by the land agent from Redemption and the town's part-time sheriff, a man whose loyalty was known to be for sale. They rode up to the house, and Leland met them on the porch. Sable watched from the kitchen window she had recently cleaned, her heart a cold knot in her stomach. Barlow, with a triumphant smirk, handed Leland a document. "This is a legal claim, Blackwood, filed this morning, cites the Territorial Water Accord of '68. It proves my primary rights to the headwaters of any creek originating on or passing through my property. That includes Blackwood Creek. I have the right to dam it, divert it, or do with it as I please." Leland's face was pale as he read the document. Sable could see the slow, creeping horror in his posture. The creek was the lifeblood of his ranch. Without it, the garden would die. The cattle would die. The land would truly, finally be dead. "This is a forgery," Leland said, his voice thick with disbelief. "My deed guarantees my rights to this creek." "Your deed is an old piece of paper," the land agent said smoothly. "This is a territorial ruling. It supersedes any local document. We can start building the dam tomorrow." The sheriff, a portly man with a nervous sweat on his brow, shifted his weight. "It's the law, Leland." "My hands are tied." They left the document on the porch railing and rode away, leaving Leland standing there like a man turned to stone. Sable came out onto the porch. The paper fluttered in the breeze. It was an execution order for the land she had poured her soul into reviving. Leland wouldn't look at her. He stared out at the horizon, at the land his father had settled, at the garden that had become a symbol of a life he thought he might be able to live again. "It's over," he said, his voice hollow. All the life that had started to return to his face, all the warmth she had glimpsed was gone. The storm was back in his eyes, colder and more final than ever. He was retreating, pulling back into the fortress of his grief where nothing and no one could reach him. "We can fight this, Sables," he said, her voice fierce. "We can go to the territorial capital, we can." With what? He cut her off, turning to face her. His expression was bleak. "With what money? With what influence? Barlow owns this town, Sable. He owns the law. I have nothing left." He looked at her then, and what she saw in his eyes broke her heart. It was defeat. This was a mistake. All of it. He gestured to the garden. Bringing this back to life. It was just a stay of execution. The land is dead. It was always meant to be. He wasn't just talking about the land. He was talking about himself. He was telling her that hope was a fool's errand, that letting her in had been a mistake. He was closing the door he had so cautiously, so tentatively begun to open. "You should go," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Barlow will make trouble. It's not safe for you here anymore. Pack your things. Leave in the morning." He was trying to protect her, she knew that. But it felt like a banishment. He was pushing her away, choosing the familiar pain of loneliness over the terrifying vulnerability of fighting for something. He turned without another word and went into the house, closing the door behind him. This time the thud felt final. It was the sound of a tomb being sealed. Sable stood on the porch, the legal document still fluttering on the railing, and felt the dust settle back over everything. The green in the garden seemed to mock her. She had brought the land back to life, but she had failed to reach the man, and without him the land meant nothing. Sable spent the evening in a state of numb despair. She packed her few belongings back into her canvas bag, her movements slow and automatic. Jed found her in the tack room, his face etched with concern. "You're not really leaving, are you, girl?" he asked, his gravelly voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "He told me to," she whispered, her throat tight. "He's given up. That man's forgotten how to fight for anything, except his own misery." Jed said with a sigh. "Don't you give up, too." He placed a small, heavy pouch on her cot. "It ain't much, but it's a month's wages. For the work you done. The best damn work this ranch has seen in years." He tipped his hat and left before she could protest. The kindness undid her. She sat on the cot and cried, silent tears of frustration and heartbreak. She had thought she was building a home, a life. She had let herself believe that the healing of the land was a promise of something more. Now it was all turning back to dust. As she sat there, her gaze fell on the main house. A single lamp was lit in one of the downstairs rooms, the office, the room he never used, the one filled with his father's books and maps and the memories he couldn't face. An idea sparked in the darkness of her mind, a faint, desperate flicker of hope. Her father, he had been a surveyor. He had taught her how to read maps, not just the lines on the paper, but the intent behind them. He always said, the law is written on the land first and on paper second. If the paper doesn't match the land, the paper is lying. Barlow's claim was about water rights that superseded a local deed. But what if the claim itself was based on a lie? What if his property lines weren't what he said they were? She couldn't leave. Not yet. Not without knowing. She waited until the house was dark, until the moon was high sky, then with her lantern turned low, she crept out of the barn and across the yard. The front door was unlocked. She slipped inside, her heart pounding. The house was cold and silent, smelling of dust and disuse. She found the office, the air thick with the scent of old paper and leather. A layer of dust covered everything. On the wall was a large, rolled-up territorial map. On the desk, under a stack of old ledgers, was a long tin cylinder. She opened it. Inside was the original deed to the Blackwood Creek Ranch. Signed and sealed 30 years ago, she unrolled the deed on the dusty floor, pinning the corners with books. Then she carefully unrolled the large territorial map beside it. By the flickering candlelight, she began to work. Her father had taught her the symbols, the language of longitudes and survey markers. She traced the lines on the old deed, her finger following the elegant script that described the property's boundaries by landmarks. Thence north along the ridge of Grayback Mountain to the Twin Oaks, thence east to the headwaters of the creek known as Blackwood. Her breath caught. The headwaters. The deed specifically mentioned the headwaters as a boundary marker that belonged to the property. She then turned to the newer territorial map. She found Barlow's property and traced its lines. His land bordered Leland's, yes. But according to this map, his property line stopped a full quarter-mile south of the creek's source. The document Barlow had presented must have been based on a fraudulent survey map, one that redrew the boundaries to place the headwaters on his land. The territorial accord he cited would only apply if the water source was on his property. It wasn't. The paper was lying. A noise from the doorway made her jump. Leland stood there, a candle in his hand. His face was a mask of exhaustion and shock. "What are you doing?" "I was supposed to leave," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement. "But I couldn't. Look." She pointed to the maps on the floor. "Look here. This is your father's deed. It grants you the land all the way to the headwaters. And this is the official territorial map. It confirms it. Barlow's property line is here." Her finger traced the line. "He has no claim to the source of the creek, none at all. His entire legal claim is based on a lie." Leland knelt beside her, his eyes scanning the maps. He traced the lines himself, his brow furrowed in concentration. He saw it. The truth laid bare in ink and paper on his dusty floor. He looked from the map to her face, illuminated by the candlelight. He saw the fierce intelligence in her eyes, the smudge of dust on her cheek, the unyielding spirit that had refused to accept defeat. She hadn't just saved his garden. She hadn't just brought his land back. She had found the weapon he needed to save his legacy. She had given him back the will to fight. In that moment, the last of the walls around his heart crumbled. He saw her not as an employee, not as an outsider, but as the one person who had looked at the ruin of his life and had seen something worth saving. He reached out and his hand gently cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away the smudge of dust. "Sable," he whispered. And the way he said her name was a revelation. It held all the words he hadn't been able to say, all the gratitude and awe and dawning affection he had kept locked away. He had told her to leave to protect her, but he knew now that sending her away would be a wound far deeper than anything Barlow could inflict. He could not lose her. He had already lost too much. The next morning, when Barlow and his men arrived with wagons full of timber and tools to start building their dam, Leland was waiting for them at the creek. He was not alone. Sable stood beside him. Jed, Gus, and Finn stood a few paces behind them, armed with shovels and pitchforks that looked surprisingly menacing. Barlow laughed when he saw them. "A welcoming party? Don't trouble yourselves." "Blackwood. We'll be done before you know it." "You're not building anything on my land, Barlow," Leland said, his voice calm and clear, carrying in the morning air. "This is my land now," Barlow sneered, waving a piece of paper. "I have the law on my side." "You have a piece of paper based on a fraudulent map," Sable said, her own voice steady and strong. "The official territorial survey shows your property line ending south of here. The headwaters of this creek belong to the Blackwood Ranch. They always have." Barlow's face paled slightly. He hadn't expected her to have that kind of knowledge. "That's a ridiculous accusation." The land agent will have to answer to the territorial marshal," Leland cut in. He held up his own document, the original deed. "I'm riding to the capital today. I'm filing charges against you and him for fraud and attempted theft of water rights. By the time I get back, there will be a warrant for your arrest." He took a step forward. "So I'll see you one last time. Get off my land." A crowd had begun to gather, townspeople drawn by the commotion. They saw Leland Blackwood, not the grieving recluse they had whispered about, but the man he used to be, strong, resolute, and unyielding, and they saw the woman who eyed him, not as a strange outsider, but as the source of his renewed strength. Barlow looked at Leland's determined face, at Sable's unwavering gaze, and at the hostile silence of the crowd, who were beginning to sense the tide turning. He knew he was beaten. With a curse, he motioned for his men to turn the wagons around. He rode away not in a cloud of dust, but in a shroud of public humiliation. Leland watched him go, then turned to Sable, in front of everyone. He reached out and took her hand. His grip was warm and firm. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and meant only for her. But his action was a public declaration for all to see. He was choosing her. He was standing with her. He had saved her from being driven out. And she had saved everything that mattered to him. The rescue was complete. A month later, the land was transformed. The creek, now cleared of the entire fallen tree thanks to the help of a repentant Gus and Finn, flowed freely, its banks green and lush. The garden had expanded, a riot of color and produce that supplied half the town. The ranch house porch no longer sagged. Leland had fixed it. The windows were clean, and pots of bright red geraniums, grown from cuttings Sable had nurtured, sat on the railing. The whole ranch felt like it had taken a deep, clean breath after years of holding its own in sorrow. The charges against Barlow and the land agent had stuck. Word from the capital was that they would both face prison time. The town of Redemption, fickle as ever, now treated Sable with a mixture of respect and awe. Mrs. Pritchard even gave her a stiff, approving nod when they passed in the street. Sable had found her place, not by asking for it, but by earning it with her own 2 hands and her sharp mind. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the valley, Leland and Sable sat on the repaired porch. He had built her a small, sturdy potting shed next to the garden, a place for her tools and seeds. It was a gift that spoke more than 1,000 flowery words. He reached over and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. It felt natural, right. "Jed told me something the day you arrived." He set his gaze on the thriving garden. "He said the land had given up. I believed him. I think a part of me had given up too." He turned to look at her, his eyes clear and full of a quiet, steady warmth. "The land came back. And I feel like I did too." Sable's heart swelled. This was the true harvest of her season of work. Not the vegetables, not the water, but this. The return of this man from the desolate country of his grief. He squeezed her hand. "I don't plan on leaving again," he said softly. "And I hope you don't either, Sable. This is your home now, if you'll have it." "I'm already home," she whispered. He smiled, a true, easy smile that reached his eyes and transformed his entire face. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the last of the sun's rays paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and blooming night flowers. The frontier was still wild, the world still uncertain, but here on this porch, with their hands intertwined, they had found their own small piece of solid ground. They had found their shelter, and they had found it together.